everyone, my name is Gabriel Rivera, and I'm here to talk about the history of rock and roll. Bam! I can guarantee that almost everyone watching this video, almost everyone, has listened to some form of rock in their lives before. Rock and roll has affected generations of Americans through the influence of music and culture trends it has inspired to us. I've done a lot of research on this topic, and as a guitarist myself, I understand the influence of rock firsthand. Today I will be covering three main points: the introduction of rock and roll, the influence to our culture today, and how it is important to us Americans. Now for the introduction of rock and roll. Rock and roll was invented in the 50s and mid-60s and was influenced by artists such as Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and Bob Dylan. Now you may not know these artists, but they were key figures in introducing the rock that we have today. Rock was introduced as a strong bass guitar beat that involved southern black and white culture put together. This was a very new style of music during this time, and the guitar was glorified as a standard of rock and roll during this time. During the beginning of rock, the music sounded more, it was a mixture of country and blues music. Again, southern, black, and white culture. Related to the sound of blues and country more than anything. That's what it sounded like. The upbeat and rhythmic beat of instruments and vocal lyrics soon began the culture that we have today. The sex and drug life, the dressing up, the rebellion of the youth, all started during the 50s and the 60s, and that was the beginning of rock and roll. After the introduction of rock in the 50s and 60s, rock continued to progress, and the culture behind it also began to change too. As it began to progress, the music started to evolve culture change within teenagers and adults that were very involved in the rock lifestyle over time. Bands and artists such as the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan, and many more were key figures in the new focused rock style music that introduced love and American exceptions during the late 60s after the first introduction of rock and roll. This new lifestyle of rock would help inevitably cause and form the hippie movement as we all know today. As we all know, the hippie movement involved sex, drugs, love, and peace. During the next decade following that, progressive rock and hard rock were introduced by famous bands such as Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd. The reaction following the introduction of this new hard rock and progressive rock would inevitably cause another movement called the punk rock movement. Punk rock was then created, and the basic form of loud guitars and rude attitudes and erased singing would form. People would dress up in mohawks and leather jackets and ultimately have a more rebellious nature and more aggression. Many garage bands would form, and everything was just more rebellious, aggressive, and more punkish, as you would say. After the 70s, this mainstream form of rock died off, and a new era of electric rock and heavy metal kicked off with a more punkish progressive rock type of way during the 80s. These types of rocks would further influence a more rebellious sex and drug lifestyle. The famous band, you may or may not know them, the Motley Crue, became a public figure of this with their crazy addictions and outrageous acts in their performances and their lifestyles. This was the 80s, and women also began to start showing their faces in bands and joining the rock movement and doing the same. When the 90s came, alternate rock was the mainstream at the time, and alternate rock became a new lifestyle. Alternate rock was more gloomier, lazier, and basically more kicked back, but it was still loud at the same time. Again, women began to start showing their faces, and inevitably alternate rock was what is present with us today. Now, also in the 90s, rap rock and more electronics came along with it. And Nirvana was a key figure in the 90s. You may not know him, the lead singer of Nirvana, Kurt Cobain. His album kicked off a new kicked off the 90s with alternate rock, and it became a trend after that. And that is what we have today, and that is the history of rock. Now, after telling you all this information about the decades of rock and roll, I want to briefly talk about why it's important to know and why it's important to us Americans. Culture is a big part of our life, and so is music. We live day to day by it and show it day to day. The decades of rock have given us examples of its influence in the past culture through examples of movements it caused. For example, the hippie movement, the punk rock movement, and even the lifestyles teenagers chose to live in the past generations. It all came to our culture. Rock not only gives us a chance to understand why people lived certain lifestyles, for example, living like a hippie, showing love, doing drugs and whatnot, but also gives us a chance to understand how our parents and past generations lived. The fashion trends, the dance moves, the daily activities were all influenced by rock music in some sort of way. So every time you listen to a rock song, question yourself, like, how does this song or this type of music influence me and how it influenced other people before me? Thank you. My name is Gabriel Rivera, and this is Rock and Roll.